morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because I know we have quite a range of time zones. Welcome back. And if you missed last week, welcome aboard. Hopefully you've started reading through some of the readings, if not all, or again, as I mentioned last week, these are not required readings, but I think you'll really get more out of the class, if you do venture out and go through all the texts, meticulously. As I also mentioned last week, we're not going to do literary analysis simply because we don't have time. And really, that's not the focus of this particular class. So we're not going to do that. And I also want to make sure we leave a good amount of time for discussion. So today, how things are going to run. I have just put an alarm to go off at noon here Eastern time to remind us that at that point, we're going to go and talk about story number 2. So we're going to spend the first half an hour on story number 1, then we'll talk about story number 2. So, all right, let's get started. Okay, so I ended last week with the 1950s to today's slide. I'm just saying that I'm going to return to this, so I am going to go through what we know from the cognitive science, computational perspective, where we are with respect to robotics, machine learning, machine intelligence, human intelligence, and robotic human-machine interaction. I will go into that, but I'm going to save that for session 4, which I think will be perfect when we enter into our discussion of simulated worlds and really the true cyborg situation we're at today. So keep that as a ... But for today, I want us to go back to the early 1800s. And really, I'm calling this the dawn of science fiction because, again, I think this always boils down to, we're always looking for dates, right? When was the first story? When a certain genre started? And it's always difficult to do that simply because I think also it's a matter of finding the text. It's a matter of having available text and resources to be able to make that type of historical annotation. But typically we can think of the dawn of science fiction as happening in the 1800s, and specifically with Mary Shelley's story, which we read for today, or parts of it that we read for today, Frankenstein. But before we go into that, I do want to make a differentiation between the fantastical world versus the Gothic world and the science fiction world. And simply because I think it sets up really nicely, why certain writers and the writers we read for today, so Offman and Shelley, how they really differ, how they take elements from these worlds and then how they differ. So fantasy genre is basically about presenting a fictional universe. It tends to be inspired and influenced by different types of myths or folklore. It originally started as an oral tradition. Of course, when we think back about storytelling since the beginning of human cave times, before we had writing systems, storytelling was an oral tradition. And so we've seen that with fantasy, it starts as an oral tradition, it enters into the literary world, it goes into the dramatical world, and then we really hit, by the 20th century, we're now using multimedia work. So when technology is really entering in further into the artistic worlds. So we can see also historically how storytelling obviously changes according to technological advancement. So the fantastical world is generally different from the science fiction world, simply because in the science fiction world, it tends to focus on themes that are based on science. And that is different from horrific type genres that tend to focus more on the macabre. And then, of course, you can enter into the gore worlds. Also in the fantasy literature, the tendency is to use magic or supernatural elements. So that's what differentiates from the science fiction type of genre world. Now, in terms of which was the first, slowly this fantastical genre has also sort of merged into the Gothic fiction, Gothic horror, Gothic gore worlds. Perhaps, and I put perhaps in quotes because again it boils down to finding the literature, but the original maybe first story of Gothic fiction, Gothic horror was originated in England. in the 1700s, around 1764-65. Horace Walpole published the story, The Castle of Otranto, a Gothic story. This is just a screenshot of one of the illustrations that's been done, one of a book that's been published, a version that's been published of that story. That's a whole, of course, a whole nother discussion. We could look at book covers of these stories. So in this particular story, it merges, the reason why it's considered Gothic fiction and coming from the fantastical world is because it merges supernatural concepts, horror, death, and romance. And I put here in a question mark that it's not necessarily known if this was Walpole's original story or not. It is a question mark as to whether it was an actual translation of a previous work that was made in from an Italian writer in Naples from the early 1500s. So again, this really brings up the question that I was mentioning earlier of it's hard to date this stuff in terms of the first story. And so, you know, what is the story about? Very brief. I actually read this story several years ago, and I remember not being quite enthralled by it, to be honest. But it's a story of Manfred, who's the prince of Otranto, whose son is about to get married to a princess, and the son gets mysteriously killed by an enormous helmet. And so there goes the supernatural element. And so Manfred decides to divorce his wife and marry the bride. So there we go with the death aspect and the romance aspects. Moving forward to now the horror Gothic, terror Gothic. Again, these are all different titles, labels that have been used to describe the Gothic genre. Again, these tend to come from academic circles. So here also, first practitioner of the horror Gothic world is considered to be Anne Radcliffe. Wonderful to hear we have a woman, a female writer. And she actually was quite popular. Apparently, I think she was one of the most well-paid novelists at the time. So this is during 18th century England. She's known for A Sicilian Romance, The Mysteries of Udolpho, and The Italian. And the reason why she became more popular in terms of what I've read about her works is that her storytelling was far more complex than that of which Walpole's work, so the Otranto Prince story. And by complex, I mean she really apparently brought in a lot of imagery and evoked a lot in terms of creating landscapes and bringing in romantic elements and really bringing in concepts of villains and also then gore and just merging all of that in highly vivid imagery. Further onto this Gothic fiction, Gothic horror world, we have really the widespread success came in the 19th century. And it basically came in with, and again, I'm talking here about English language works. So Shelley's Frankenstein, Edgar Allan Poe is also known for his works of this kind, also Charles Dickens, and of course Stoker's Dracula. So Gothic, the term originates from the Goths, so peoples of the East, Germany. And it refers to medieval Gothic architecture. And so because it refers to that, that tends to be the setting for stories. This does not mean that that is always the case. Certainly, I think here, as we move into the 20th century and to today, that has changed. But the concept of castles, monsters, ghosts, secret tribunals, cults, remote times in terms of the Middle Ages, remote places, so, of course, we're talking here about England. So, for them, Italy and the Middle East is a very exotic place for them. But so evil villains, beautiful heroines, that tends to be all these tend to be very common in this world. And so I wanted to just mention this because this is going to set us up for what we read for today. So, very briefly. Okay, so we have only now about 18 minutes to cover Offenbach's their Sandman. And let me give you a quick background about the author. So Ernst Theodor Wilhelm Hoffmann, he is known as Ernst Theodor Amadeus Hoffmann. The reason why he's Amadeus as opposed to Wilhelm, he actually changed his name because he was giving an homage to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was born in 1776 in Prussia. and died in Berlin in 1822. He actually was educated as a lawyer, and he became a Prussian law officer. He became a counselor in the Court of Appeal in Berlin in 1816. His main love, his passion really was music. So he was actually a well-known also conductor, composer, music critic, and painter. Therefore, thus you can see now why he would want to name himself in homage to Mozart. If you know the classical musical world, the ballet Arlequin from 1811 and the opera Undine in 1816 may be known to you. So in terms of his writing, so he actually wrote quite a lot of short stories, 2 novels. He is considered a German romantic writer of fantasy and Gothic horror. So in our little very quick review of fantasy and horror, you understand what that means, and hopefully you're already picturing how that affects the story that we read for today. So he actually, prior to writing Der Sandman, he actually wrote this other story of the automaton, and he wrote that one in 1814. And the reason why I mention it is because I think it's crucial to understand really this story that we've read for today. But this particular one was a short story that appeared in a very popular, common, well-known, German language general music newspaper about musical events. And the reason why the story appeared in that newspaper was because in this story, which is about 2 friends and a fortune-telling automaton, the Turk, the idea was that this automaton could reveal through his utterances his supernatural and psychic abilities. And in this whole discussion, actually, he often spends a good deal talking about artificial intelligence, but more on the concept of music performance and music instruments, with this idea that machines are capable of bringing forth nature's voice. So what I mean by that is that it was really about thinking of machines and / instruments as vehicles of recreating sonority and what we call timbre in music, so the quality of sound. And we need to keep in mind that during this time, a lot of different instruments were being made, and these are just a few here mentioned, which you can think of as precursors to different types of horns and harpsichords type instruments. And one really significant technological advancement at the time was here in 1810 to 1812, we had Johann Kaufmann, who had actually created the Trumpet Player. So this was available at the time, and it was actually considered one of the most famous androids. And it was basically of a man, quote here, quote, dressed in Spanish costume, and his lungs were made out of leather bellows. The reeds were meant to imitate trumpet sounds, and apparently it was capable of creating 2 different types of tones. And so having this background, now we can talk about Der Sandman, because we are now aware that the writer, Hoffmann, is someone who is involved in the musical world very intimately. I mean, he actually is composing works. He was fascinated by instruments and automated instrumentation. And this type of technology was already available, which makes sense, right? Because remember our discussion last week where we talked about Da Vinci's work, right? That was influenced by Al-Jazari and previous Chinese and Middle Eastern inventors and engineers. And so we can see that we have been, now we're talking about Germany here. And so we see from Italy, so from China, so Asia, to the Middle East, to Italy, to Germany, we see that this concept of thinking about humans being represented in some sort of mechanical way is happening, is influencing others' ideas and inventions, and certainly is influencing Hoffmann as a writer. So, Der Sandman, written 1815, 1816, published in the Night Pieces in 1817. So it's basically an epistolary, what we call an epistolary short story, which means it's a story that's written through the use of letters. And so, of course, for us, that may not be, we may find that odd, right? Perhaps we would write something in terms of string of emails or texts, because we no longer write letters, or maybe we still do. So that was actually pretty popular in the 18th century to do this type of writing, of using the concept of journals and diaries. So here, their Sandman is actually referring to Western and Northern European folklore specifically. So here's that fantasy element. So it's really, the idea was that the Sandman was a mythical character that puts people to sleep and gives them good dreams by sprinkling magical sand onto their eyes. For their Sandman, it's certainly not so so innocent and calm and beautiful and kind. The type of sprinkling, magical sprinkling that happens here is now entering, of course, into the more macabre and maybe even horror-ish elements. And so who are our main characters? We have Nathaniel, the main guy here, Lothar, who's the friend of Nathaniel, Clara, who's Lothar's sister, or Nathaniel's sweetheart or betrothed. And then we have this interesting character, right? We have Coppelius, who's also Coppola, who's also the Sandman, or that's a question. Are they really all one and the same character? Professor Spallanzani with his automaton. He has created his daughter, quote unquote here, Olympia. We have mention of Nathaniel's father and Sigmund. And so I'm going to now open to, in this next 11 minutes, to comments, questions, and kind of what people thought of this story. And I just put these two ideas here, the role of eyes and perception of the world, so reality versus imagination and fantasy. Or maybe, you know, what was the difference between, how does the author represent the difference between the human female, Clara, versus the robotic female, Olympia? And because now, as we switch onto to Mary Shelley, we have a very different concept now. And as a female writer, we have a whole different world. So let me do a quick introduction, just real quick. I didn't go through it, but for those of you who are interested in further the many representations have been done of this particular story, but those of you in the musical classical world, so Jacques Offenbach actually did the opera of Claude, Les Contes d'Hoffmann, so the short stories of Hoffmann. He actually has 3, he makes off of 3. And so what I'll do is I'll share this link. It's a section from the opera in which it shows Olympia performing in the ball dance. So I will share this link in purpose to, you know, considering time right now, I won't go through it, but I will share it with you guys. So you can see sort of also, how did you imagine this Olympia character? You know, I mean, certainly Hoffmann describes her, but you know, what was she wearing? How does she really move? How does she really sing? And so, and also one sort of like tragic note with respect to Offenbach, he finished writing his opera in 1880. It was premiered in Paris in February of 1881, literally 4 months right after Offenbach died. And he had really wanted to see his chef d'oeuvre, right? His work being performed, and he unfortunately didn't. But it's just an interesting tidbit here. So again, I'll share the link here that I have with you guys in a following email class. Okay, so Mary Shelley. This is just a screenshot from one of the books, the illustrations that have been done from many publication versions of this story. The author, so here, Mary, now we're going to the UK. Traveling to the UK right now. So Mary Shelley, so this book was actually, the story was published in 1818. She published it anonymously. She later published it with her name in 1823, and then republished it in 1831 with revisions, and actually as an homage, as a tribute to her husband who drowned in 1822. And it's interesting because the very story of Frankenstein, in terms of going from scientific discovery to victimization, it's interesting that in her own life there would almost be a reflection of what she had written in fiction would happen in nonfiction. She's the daughter of William Godwin, a very well-renowned political philosopher, and Mary Wollstonecraft, another amazing and wonderful philosopher and feminist. She married the Romantic poet and philosopher Percy Shelley at a very young age. I mention this simply because what this shows us is that we have a very cultured writer in Mary Shelley. She knew much about the world, multiple languages. She was quite an avid reader, and with philosopher parents, I mean, you can just imagine the, well, unfortunately, her mother died. I think it was actually during birth or very soon after Mary Shelley's birth. But her father, I mean, she learned from her father and from the huge amount of books that were made available to her. So she's mainly known for Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. And for just quick sort of who's Prometheus, another term, a word label for the forethinker. So this comes from Greek mythology. So he's known as being a trickster, as the god of fire. He's basically credited as a hero for creating humans from clay. So again, this idea of going from inanimate objects to animacy, and defying gods by stealing fire and returning it to earth and humanity. And the idea that by doing that, progress in civilization can happen. This a little screenshot here is just of a statue. If you have been to New York City, this is right in front of the Rockefeller Center. So that is Prometheus. And so within Western classical tradition, the idea is that this character, this individual, embodies the concept of the genius whose attempts to improve humanity also, by definition, will bring upon tragedy. So that is the core concept in which Mary Shelley is inspired by, dealing with. So she is certainly inspired by her own, as I said, her own parents' writings and work. Apparently, she drew upon nightmares she had in writing this story. What happened here, so in reading letters of hers when she describes the writing, the creation of the story, so the way it was created was that in 1816, she was actually in a sort of retreat, I guess you can call it, hanging out with friends in Geneva in Switzerland, and she happened to be with poet Lord Byron, the physician, Dr. John Polidori, poet, her husband, Percy Shelley, and Mary Goodwin. And so these are the idea here that I want to put is that all these individuals were advocates of Romanticism. And so what I mean by Romanticism here is we're talking about a type of inspiration and thinking of the world in terms, really one with nature, and understanding what the passions are and the desires are, and experiences of the individual, again, versus the concepts of science and Enlightenment's concepts of reason and objectivity. And in reading through Mary Shelley's letters, she actually she knew what was happening scientifically at the time, and she actually thought, she literally said, quote, "Perhaps a corpse would be reanimated. Galvanism had given token of such things. Perhaps the component parts of the creature might be manufactured, brought together, and endued with vital warmth," which is exactly what she ends up doing with her story, right? And so it turns out that in this retreat, they all decided to write a horror story. They sort of, I guess you can consider it, they kind of thought of it as a game. They were like, okay, everybody write a horror story and we'll share our ideas later. And it turns out that Shelley did have a nightmare during one of the nights of that retreat in Geneva. And it was the following, because she actually talks about it in her letters. And she says, "I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, health, vital motion." Exactly what what she ended up creating with her scientist, and Dr. Frankenstein creating his exact version of that. So just so you know, also very successful within this group, Polidori's story was actually later published in 1819, known as The Vampire, which would be the precursor to Stoker's Dracula in 1897. So she wasn't the only one who had who came out with the most amazing story. So currently, scientifically, referring to galvanism, right? So this comes from Luigi Galvani, the Italian scientist. So 1770s, galvanism came about, the understanding of it. So that was the idea of muscle convulsions through electrical charges. So the verb, right, galvanize means to stimulate to action. In 1803, Giovanni Aldino, who happened to be a disciple of Galvani, they actually demonstrate it. And the screenshot here actually comes from the illustrations from one of the publications. They demonstrate the technique on the body of an executed criminal in London. And they also created an experiment, which is where came the theory of Galvani's theory, coming from here, this print from the original from 1791 publication, in which they connected a dead frog. I don't know, it says dead front, a dead frog connected to a lightning rod. And so the idea was that they created this idea or concept called animal electricity theory. So basically the concept that animals generate electricity and they use this electricity to make their body move. And so this becomes then related and has an effect in our understanding of human physiology. And so more and more, we were no longer thinking about, again, so we have the Enlightenment, and so we're no longer thinking about human capacity or movement as supernatural things or divine concepts, but more as concepts of physics, of mathematics, and of logic. Certainly, we haven't yet come into the cognition concept yet, but we certainly are thinking more in mechanical, physical terms. And so this is, Mary Shelley is perfectly aware of this. And so her story then becomes a reflection, I think, of such. And so, okay, I had you read certain parts of the story, the whole story. If you haven't read it, please do. I think it's fascinating. And as really, at the time, I don't think Mary Shelley thought she was creating science fiction. She was probably thinking she was still in the Gothic world, fantastical world, but she is considered probably the pioneer of science fiction simply because she's using current scientific concepts and methods and ideas to influence her character. And so these are just some points I'm going to bring out here. So the pains and joys of scientific discovery, which I had you read very specifically, is I wanted to bring that out of what does it mean to be the scientist? You know, what is our role as human beings, but especially scientists in creating other beings? And I bring this up because this is going to become really important for the Japanese story we're going to read, in which questions and issues of genetic engineering, and of course today with CRISPR technology, you know, we really are in this moment where we can do this. But, you know, this is something she's already bringing up. And then, of course, Frankenstein's stages of development, actually chapters that I had you read 11, 12, and 13 specifically. So the 4, 5 were really about this scientific searching, and you know, he talks about Shelley describes her main character really going through the toils of really wanting to understand life, death, the body, physiology. How does it come about? Why does it come about? And you know, he goes through many hours and days and months of labor and sweat and tears, and pale and sickliness. And so I thought that as myself a scientist, I understand those moments where you're really looking for that, searching for that moment of truth, and you're just toiling away, trying different experiments and more experiments, and it can get exhausting. But then it's joyful, you know, when you're like, I have some data, I have some results. And so in the case of Frankenstein, for him, it's not so much of a joy, right? As soon as he creates his being, he's actually terrified by his own creation. And then the chapters 11, 12, and 13, the reason why I had you guys read that is because in stark contrast to Hoffman, so they're actually writing around the same time, right? Early 1800s. And we have Hoffman, which I mentioned his background, and we have Mary Shelley, who's very much a philosopher, and quite the intellectual in that sense, and because certainly Hoffman is an intellectual as well. But they create very different, vastly different characters. We have the male writer who creates the female witless robot, and we have the female writer who creates a very interesting conscious being. And the reason why I had you guys read, focus on 11, 12, and 13 is because I don't know if Shelley was aware of this, but she quite beautifully, I think, goes through the developmental stages of a human being through her character. And so I just wanted to highlight, I literally just wrote this list. And again, I'm going to share the slides with you guys. But she starts almost with what happens in infancy, right? Where everything is just about reflexes. And I don't know if you know this, but actually when we're born, our vision is not yet perfect, right? We don't have adult vision until 1 year old, basically. And the way she describes her creation, Frankenstein's creation, in terms of things being, for the first time, feeling, sensation, light, sort of not understanding what objects are. And she slowly progresses up, and I kind of wrote the list here, so multiplicity of senses, feeling, seeing, hearing, smelling, just overwhelming visual stimulation, then being thirsty and hungry, then feeling cold, then starts to understand forms and objects because animals, starts to imitate bird songs. So think about when we're infants, or if you have an infant that you are living with, that they start to imitate sounds, right, and babbling, inarticulate sounds. Then there's the experience of pain. So, right, the monster creation here starts to understand heat from fire, pain. Experimenting with food, disliking some. He dislikes the wine, but he likes the cheese, right? The milk. Then he starts to understand love and affection. So these are complex emotions. Starts to learn words, and there's even a description of when he's like, oh, that's the word for father, brother, sister. Then there's awareness of his own physical deformity. Then there's knowledge of beauty, right? So then he sees this family in the cottage, right? And then, of course, when a stranger or a foreigner comes in, he's like, oh, wow, there's something so beautiful about this individual. Oh, they speak another language. So understanding that other people speak different languages from your own. Then his own language improves. So the monsters, quote unquote, your own language improves, starts to imitate, starts to comprehend. And then finally, at the end of that chapter 13, I think we get to the classic, je pense, donc je suis, I think, therefore I am, right? So what was I? And that's a beautiful, I think, just a sort of wonderful description of how we cognitively develop from infancy to adulthood. So I find fascinating that the creation that Mary Shelley would create would be a very human-like creation, while the creation that Offman would create would remain just this mechanical thing. Real quick, I just wanted to put some slides here from Vision Science, so you realize that our newborn, this is how we, so it's really by 1 year, how our vision works, and we don't have 3D vision yet when we're born. We develop it by the time we're 3 months old, 4 months old, we have 3D capacity of vision. And so you can see that can affect then how we start understanding our relationship with objects. Another thing I wanted to mention with respect to language development, again, I'm bringing this up because this is going to be crucial to understanding how we're developing robotic systems today. So when I talk about the 50s to today, so we have this interesting phase of from birth, we're crying, then we start cooing, then there's the babbling and the gurgling, and very interestingly, we know from linguistic research that our babbling actually mimics the phonetic and up and down contours of the native language we're learning. And then we enter into one-word utterances, right? And then two-word utterances. And then we finally kind of get to what we call telegraphic stage, where we start expanding our syntax and our vocabulary by 2.5 years old. So by 3.5, 4 years old, we have pretty much full-on adult language capacity. Exactly what Frankenstein, right? His creation goes through. And one last element I wanted to enter here is we think back to Jean Piaget's the Swiss psychologist, who ended up creating a set of stages of cognitive development, and really understanding the human concept of mental representation, cognition, really how we go from understanding the world in sort of basic elements to really having abstract moral reasoning, abstract logic, and how we go from egocentric phases and we exit that phase. So everything, egocentrism meaning me, right? So that's why the infant once thinks that the world revolves around himself. And then finally around 3 years old, you're like, oh, other people can actually have ideas and emotions and feelings that are the same or different from myself. And that would be called theory of mind. So I find fascinating as someone who's a scientist, a cognitive scientist, that Mary Shelley would go through all of this, maybe unknowingly, I don't know. But I just wanted to bring that up because I think that would be fundamental to what we will discuss with the next story. So we're now at the end of class. Thank you.